All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Michael Garofola. We're at Martin Woods Winery, McMinnville. It's March 3rd, 2020. Michael, thanks so much for joining us today. First question for you, most important question. Why wine?
I feel like to get into why I am where I am now doing production, etc., you have to trace kind of all the way back for me, and it always it always goes back to what my job has always been, and that's been in the restaurant business. I mean, I've been in the restaurant business. I'm still in the restaurant business technically. Well, that's my job since I was essentially 17. So it's just the only thing I've ever been good at, quite honestly. But I got into wine as a buyer at a little kind of red sauce Italian strip mall Italian restaurant in Phoenix. It's kind of a suburb of Phoenix in the mid 2000s. That's when I first started waiting tables and had you call it a wine program would be generous, but it was just like I was tasked to order the wine for the restaurant, and that's where I had to start understanding what wine was. I mean, honestly, I was not a wine drinker prior to that, but that was when kind of the bug, I guess, started, if you will. Spent a little bit of time in Italy after I left Phoenix before moving to Santa Fe, and became really, luckily, kind of fell backwards onto the sommelier position at a restaurant called The Compound, Mark Kiffin's restaurant on Canyon Road. And I totally didn't deserve that job at the time, but that's when I studied for my first SOM level, whatever, the certification level. Nothing fancy past that. But essentially, I became a wine buyer. I moved to Portland in 2007. And really one of the reasons why I moved to Oregon specifically was because of the wine country. And it was probably the wine country as a buyer that I think spoke the most to me, I guess. I remember drinking just wines at the Compound and just feeling like Oregon was different than California or Washington, and especially what that restaurant was getting. I felt like the Oregon wines were more my speed, and I felt like Portland was also on the rise at that point. It was, well, quite honestly, it was one of the only places on the West Coast that you can afford to live. Seattle was too expensive, and Bay Area is too expensive, and I lived in LA, and I still hated LA at that point. I've changed my position on Los Angeles at this point, but moved here, and I just was in restaurants, and that's, again, as a sommelier and on the GM side of things for years. And I think at Top of Mediterranean Bistro, I was no longer there. Genoa, it's no longer there, but old school restaurant. And now I'm currently at Beast, where I still buy the wine. So I've had 3 jobs since living in Portland. But I think at a certain point with a lot of buyers, as you get older and you're like, I don't want to be, because I went down the GM route, and that didn't work out. It never works out. It's like anybody who's ever interested in being a GM for a restaurant, text me, because it's a bad idea. But it can be great, but not in my experience. I was just not good at it. But as you get older in the business, in the restaurant business, you're like, okay, what am I going to do long term? What are my passions? When Evan from Martin Woods moved here in 2009, he started working at Belle Pont, and he was working on production, and that was my first exposure to productions, being on the sorting line at Belle Pont, 2009, 2010 maybe, and had great experiences with those guys, with Brian and Jill and Evan, and it was just fun. I staged for Bow and Arrow. I think you also interviewed for Scott in 2012 and 2013. And then, was partner at a smaller label called Holden, and I have segued out of that. And ultimately, when I was still with Holden, I started taking classes at Chemeketa. And the intention originally was to take winemaking classes, was to take enology classes. My first class, and my teacher was Jessica Cortell, right? And it was a vine physiology course, so it was like the first thing you take, right? And I immediately was more drawn to the idea of viticulture and taking viticulture classes than I was enology classes. They had the cool test vineyard there, and I took the vineyard series where you have 5 rows of something and you screw it up all year, and you hopefully learn a lot. I feel like I did. And I was Jess's last class, I believe, and she was a great person to have as your teacher. She's just a wealth of information, and it was I've learned a lot, and I could still text her if something looks weird in the vineyard. I'm like, what the hell is this? So it's nice. So that was the route I went. So I was just working at Beast and going to night school, at Chemeketa, and took, what I considered, I think, the pertinent classes. I mean, I didn't go to OSU. I didn't get I didn't get the associates or the degree or whatever. I mean, I missed a couple typing classes, I suppose. But I feel like I took what was necessary for me to kind of be pushed off, the dock, and I could take it from there. And that's when simultaneously the idea for Cutter was kind of, brewing. That's where it all started, and that 2017 was my first vintage. So, and I think I finished school, or I finished taking classes, I should say, in 2016 I think that's right. And like summer, I think, or spring of 16. Anyway, as I was getting out of school, I emailed Brian McCormick of Idiot's Grace in Mosier, and we'd been working with this little block of Dolcetto for a few years with Holden. But I didn't even mention it when I emailed him. I simply said, hey, I'm getting out of wine school, so to speak, and I want a little test vineyard where I can set up my practicum for a year, and like place where I can work in the vines, do a lot of the handwork, and buy the fruit, and that's it. I just want to participate in it. I don't want to just buy fruit. Because of the viticultural background. That's half of it for me, is being in the vineyard. And McCormick got back to me and it's like, yeah, you could take over that Dolcetto block. I don't want it anymore. It was really lucky. I think he was shifting everything over to his estate at that point. So it was just perfect timing. It was just dumb luck, that I got that. And that was the first vintage, was 2017, and just that little block of Dolcetto. Now I have a second vineyard that I work in and buy fruit from in the Dalles, called Hillside.
So before we get into that, I want to back up a little bit to your restaurant experience, and I'm especially curious. You mentioned sort of being hired as a somm when you maybe didn't deserve to be a somm yet. I'm curious about learning to build a wine list, learning to appreciate wine, and build a restaurant wine list. How did you do that? How do you build a restaurant wine list?
Well, I mean, there's not just one way to do it. That's certainly true. I feel like, I think I was talking about this last night or something like that. I feel like it's important to not educate people as guests. I think you want to give people what they want. Ultimately, you want the guests to have a good experience. But you also want to surprise people sometimes. And I feel like whether that's a retail shop or a restaurant, a somm or whatever, I feel like if a guest has an experience that they're like, oh crap, I've never had a wine from this region before in my life, and it was unlike anything I'd ever had in my life. And then the next time they come, they have another experience similar to that. And there's, in Portland, we've we've been very lucky. I think there's a number of really fantastic local distributors that bring in some really interesting wines from all over the world, from to France, to Italy, to Spain, to Germany, to Hungary. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of good wine to choose from, which it wasn't always that way in Portland. I mean, it was there's a lot of things that are still being represented today, being sold in Portland and in Oregon, but the diversity of what we get is so much better. So I think, long story short, you need to taste a lot. You need to have an open mind. You need to, I feel like, not be satisfied with being stagnant. And I feel like, when I first got into wine and was buying, it was like, okay, you have a restaurant wine list, it's the Compound or it's Table or whatever, and well, I've got to have a Pinot by the glass. Well, I've got to have a Chardonnay by the glass. I've got to have a Cabernet by the glass, because I don't know. I just feel like that's what, you're supposed to do, right? That's what McCormick and Schmidt says. So it's like, that's what I need to do. You don't know any better, and I feel like you could still give people the experience they want by selling them a wine from Spain, for example, or wherever, that could still hit all the points that somebody who wants that cab wants to hit, but then and I think for me that's the fun of it. Is it's like, yeah, I gave you what you want, but you didn't even know it. And I think that was the kind of the philosophy I still take at Beast, and how I've always constructed my tasting menus over the years. And something familiar but something unexpected is, I guess, how I've always done it. Not that I'm super cognizant of it always when I'm doing it, but that's kind of where I naturally land, I guess.
Before that, you mentioned being kind of bitten by the wine bug at a kind of an unlikely place, with a kind of a smaller wine list. What about wine intrigued you at that point?
I remember the first bottle of Canetto I had from an Aglianico from Basilicata, southern Italy, and I'd never heard of Aglianico, and it kind of like locked something into me, like where it was like, I've never heard of this grape. It's not Cab, it's not Pinot. I can't really pronounce it very well. I'm from Indiana, I'm dumb. But it tastes unlike anything I've ever had. From this D'Angelo Canetto that I think is, for me, I was just really lucky to have some of those wines, back in the day. But I think that was where it started. It doesn't have to be, what you're taught. It can be what you find for yourself and what you explore. And I think that's more important than anything, and is having it's better to have a spirit of exploration in wine than I think it does to be like a master sommelier and know all the coastal regions of China. Cool. You can do that at a party. That's a good trick. Whatever. Anyway, that's where I landed there.
Tell me about the experience of learning wine then without the formal education, before Chemeketa, when you're still in Santa Fe and you're a somm and you're kind of learning and tasting. Tell me about how you experienced it. How did you go about learning? Well,
in books. I read wine books, and that was the first thing. I always felt like, especially early on like that, when I was still pretty rough around the edges. Not that I'm very refined these days, but I feel like I would be just cooking dinner, and you'd have wine open, and you'd have the wine encyclopedia by Thomas Stevenson open at the same time, reading about the region that you're drinking in your glass. And I think you do that enough. That's one element. Outside of a number of kind of just textbooks, and not textbooks per se, but just wine books that that's you gotta get into it a little bit. And now this was before I don't want to say internet, because the internet existed then, but I was not as it was before iPhones, and everything was so connected that way. So you still you had all your big books, and you carried them around everywhere, your wine atlas, your wine encyclopedia, whatever you're reading. And I feel like that was a part of where I, how I guess built the vocabulary and the database, if you will. But I remember when I was taking my certification level SOM from Master Court in 2007, I remember when I was leading up to the test, after I'd passed the very first introductory class, I remember making my wine reps blind taste me on everything they were bringing me for the week. It was just our regular appointments, but I had everybody brown bag everything. And you do that for 3-4 months prior to your exams, and it's gonna help. And I was lucky I had a program that I could do that with at the time. It would be probably a little harder. I guess you'd figure out how to do it, whatever is put in front of you. But that's what I had, so that's what I did.
What's changed for you as a wine buyer from that to what you do now with Beast? Are you still looking for a similar? You mentioned like kind of surprising people with familiarity almost. Is that still kind of what you're looking for now, or what are you looking for when you're buying wine? I
mean, when I do the pairings at Beast, it's 6 courses. The menu changes every 2 weeks. And obviously people come there for the experience of Beast, and people come from all over the country and sometimes all over the world to dine there. And so the food is on a really high level, obviously. And so I just want the wine to be on that same level as well. And that's kind of the goal. But maybe more importantly, I'm looking for, a perfect complement to every dish. And I go about that in different ways, ultimately. There's different styles, I guess, of how to pair food and wine. But ultimately, I'm trying to, accentuate, the dish. And it's like really so much that if you don't get the wine pairings when you come to Beast, you're really missing half of it. I'm biased, clearly. But that's what they pay me to do. So,
are you looking for? Are there certain regions you try to represent? Are there certain size wineries you try to represent, or is it really just right wine for the food?
I mean, my philosophies in what I buy can parallel how I make my own wines. I kind of come from that, low intervention side, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I don't want to say natural, because that's not the whole truth. I mean, that's kind of where I land a lot of times, but it's not a prereq necessarily. I don't think all natural wines are good, and I don't think all wines that aren't natural aren't. So I feel like ultimately, yes. I mean, I'm looking for balance, between the wine and the food. But where I typically land, and where I've always kind of landed, and for a pretty long time, ultimately, my palate's changed over the years, and I think that happens. But I don't love all the same wines that I did in 2008 or 2009. But I will say that by and large, most of the people that I represent are smaller family wineries. I don't have like a case production in my head. That's a little bit too much, but. Usually starts on the farming side for me. I typically will buy wines that are, practicing organic or biodynamic, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of where I begin in the cellar. Not looking for necessarily like low intervention, because that's a slippery slope, but I feel like native yeasts are important. I feel like not, doctoring the wines up too much through techniques or oak or whatever. I'm looking for balance. I'm looking for freshness, vibrancy, and I think sometimes the more techniques you discharge at a wine, it isn't always the best thing for the wine. But what do I know?
Well, let's talk about now how that relates to your wine. So you started Cutter Cascadia. You start with Dolcetto. Did you want to start with Dolcetto? Was that just because the grapes were available?
A little bit of both. I mean, above and beyond probably any other country in the world of wine, Italy's kind of where I'm like the most, have the warmest feelings for, I should say. Especially the region that Dolcetto's from, Piedmonte, in the northwest corner, of course. It's famous for Nebbiolo, Barolo, Barbaresco, etc. But Dolcetto, Barbera, among a few others, also grow there. And Dolcetto has been grown in the valley. There's people that grow it down here as well, but it also does pretty well in the gorge. And I'm not sure when the first cuttings of Dolcetto came into the gorge. I'm sure it's probably the 90s or 2000s, so it's not like it has a long tradition or anything like that. But I think the climate, especially of Hood River, and I feel like even like Mosier can ripen it. And it does really well in that kind of, in those microclimates of the gorge. And the gorge is a whole different animal when it comes to like different terroirs and sites and topography, et cetera. But Dolcetto does pretty well in Hood River and in that area. It's a challenging variety. It's a really sensitive variety in the vineyard. It shows stress pretty easily, which always freaks you out, obviously. But with the baby blue, the wine that I make from that block, I'm always happy with the results of it, or I have been so far. And so, as much as I want to like panic in August when everything's turning weird colors, and like what is happening, it always turns out pretty well. But Dolcetto, yes, is not necessarily my favorite grape variety in the world. I don't have one. It's like don't ask me that question. Like, what's your favorite grape? Okay, just. Sorry. But I feel like Dolcetto, the classic examples of it, and I feel like that's where being a somm helps being a winemaker, and vice versa. Being a winemaker helps me be a somm, honestly, nowadays. But I feel like Dolcetto in its classic state, if you will, in Piedmont, Dolcetto is high in tannin, dark in color, has high anthocyanins, and really moderate to low sugar, or pHs, I should say, acids. So it can be a trick. It can be a tricky cultivar to grow, but ultimately Dolcetto wants to be consumed young for the most part. There's a few examples of age-worthy Dolcetto coming out of Piedmont. I'm not necessarily trying to make that. I'm just trying to make Dolcetto that you can pop immediately, and you're not gonna be like, oh, I should have waited 10 years to open that. None of my wines I make in that fashion, at least at this point. But Dolcetto is just a happy table wine. It's supposed to be on the table with food, and it's just supposed to be delicious, and the tannins are really what freshens up the wine. It's not the acidity, which a lot of wines like Pinot really rely on acid to like freshen the palate, at least for me. So Dolcetto is not supposed to be necessarily something that's fussed over. It's just supposed to be consumed, and not in a thoughtless way necessarily. It's not like don't appreciate it in any way, but I think it also is a wine that you can pop on a Wednesday night when you're making bolognese and penne, or whatever. It's easy. It's a pizza wine, right? It's pizza wine. So why not? I love pizza.
Take me through the sort of the first harvest. You've started your label. You have your vineyard. What about the rest of it? Finding equipment, finding a place, having a name, all the kind of detail you had to do to make your first vintage.
Crap. It's a lot. Well, I guess I should start with the name, Cutter. Cutter it's a reference to my kind of hometown in Bedford, Indiana, southern Indiana, which is about 30 miles south of Bloomington, which is where IU is. Limestone country. That's kind of what is traditionally, or in the 20th century, what made it, gave people jobs, I should say. And that's what my great-grandfather did when he came from southern Italy in the early 20th century. He was a cutter, he was a carver, he was a stonemason. and worked in the quarries, died in the quarries, literally. But so there's been a long tradition of like stonemasonry in that area, so cutters. My parents' high school, it was the Bedford Stonecutters, right? And it's like, that was the mascot. But really, it's partially that. But it's also, have you seen the movie Breaking Away? It's about Little 500, the bicycle race. They call the townies, like the redneck kids from Bloomington, cutters. They're like the idiots that are never going to do anything in their life. So I kind of identify with that. And I feel like that was just me in a nutshell. It's just, I'm like, nobody really had any expectations for me. It was good that I'm where I'm at, I guess. But I'm just, it's just kind of, they're kind of screw-offs. So, it kind of that irreverency speaks to me. And that's what, hence Cutter Cascadia, being from Cascadia now. So that's the name. The first year, so 2017 was, I couldn't have asked for a crazier vintage right out of the gate. I knew I was going to make the wines here with Evan. We have an arrangement for me to make my wines here, and I help him at harvest and help him bottle, and I'm the harvest cook now, and I do more cooking at harvest than I do anything else, because my wine's easy. I only have like 450 cases to manage. He's, while he's doing all his crap, I'm making lunch, I'm making meatballs. So that was the arrangement here for the first couple of years. And as far as, how the 2017 vintage was, like right out of the gate. So, I took that vineyard and pruned it, and the little vineyard called Von Floto in Western Hood River. I went through the entire growing season, being out there 3-4 days a week, and doing all the handwork and the canopy management myself, and calling the sprays and the spray chemistries. Not physically doing the sprays, there's an orchard manager that does that, but I work with him to do the sprays, etc. But really the story, you can't get around the fires of 2017 when I talk about Cutter. It's like, it's forever like kind of like ingrained into the mythology of the brand. And that is, the Eagle Creek fires that happened in it's like our first week of September, I want to say, really put, a mark on that first vintage. Everything was looking pretty fine until that happened, and it was a trip, It was the only fruit I had. It was a little half-acre block. It was all Dolcetto. I was going to make a rosé, and I was going to make a red out of the block. But, being on the west side of Hood River, that part of Hood River was pretty affected by smoke and fires, and it was just like psychedelic out there. It was just like, you can look at the sun through the clouds, and it was orange and like red, fire and brimstone colors. It was scary, It reminded me of being in Los Angeles years ago when there was like wildfires, and where it's just really trippy, and it was raining ash in Portland, and out in the vineyards it was not easy to work in, doing like cluster weights and stuff like that, and like a mask and all the stuff. So I made smoked wines the first year. I didn't have a choice, really. I didn't have anything to blend it with. I certainly wasn't going to dump it. But ultimately I made the wines the way I felt they should have just been made, based on what the raw materials were and what I felt like they should be. And it resonated with a lot of people, that vintage, obviously because people still remembered the fires in Portland, and that's where I sold all my wine. That first vintage was Portland. But and to be fair, like, it was they were very polarizing wines, I feel like, whereas like half the buyers just were like, I can't do it, and half of them like freaked out over it, and a lot of people like those wines. So that was my first vintage, in a nutshell. Was fire wine. So
So about your sort of vineyard neighbors at that time and the community in that part. What were their reactions as
to the fire?
To the fire and the smoke?
Well, I mean, I don't really have much connection to the farmers around that. I mean, it's all orchards around me, but I'm like a little vineyard inside of that. But you know, I remember. I think the one thing that stands out to me in the apex of the fires and of like the evacuation warnings and stuff. I remember going out one afternoon on a day that they were under Hood River, that part of Hood River, Odell, I believe, was on like stage 2 evacuation. It was not like get out, it wasn't get out, but it was like get ready to get out. And you know, Lucia, who's the owner of the property, and her and Andy have the house and the vineyards and the orchards. When I pulled up to the property, she was like hosing down the shrubs and the garden and the trees around their house, and said essentially, yeah, we're under evacuation, you know, stage 2, etc. And I was like, I'm gonna go like, you know, do cluster weights, you know, or something like that. I'm like, all right, well, let me know if you get that call, I guess. And I got her, information down. I didn't have it prior to that. But you know, you're looking down the vineyard rows and like, can I get out of here if like something happens? But nothing happened. And like, you know, being a little, you know, exaggerating a little bit. But I feel like we were pretty lucky with the Eagle Creek fires. It could have been so much worse, as we've seen in Southern Oregon, and we've seen in Napa, Sonoma. So I was never in like danger. It was just like, I just smelled like I'd been drinking beers in front of a campfire for 4 days, you know, every time I came home, and my car stunk and like I stunk, and yeah, the wines, you know, got smoked. So they were just sitting out in it for 3 weeks. But anyway, yeah.
So that gives your preceding vintages a lot to live up to after that. So tell me about Tell me about the next year and sort of growing.
I swear to God, the first time I pulled the rosé for somebody and they're like, "Oh, it smells smoky." I'm like, "Shut up." No, it doesn't. There's no fires. Don't do this to me right now. So no, but I mean, yeah, that happened more times than I would have liked, you know, and I feel like, you know, 2018 was the vintage that I feel like I still had to talk about 2017 because it was still so recent. And, you know, those wines in 2017 were so unique and unreal that, you know, there was still a reference point, you know, to talk to. And, you know, I guess it was more of an icebreaker, I should say. It was like, well, there's no fires this year, so there's that, you know. But, you know.
You mentioned you have a second vineyard you're working with now. So tell me about I know you're still brand new business, but tell me about the kind of the evolution so far and what you're hoping for from the second vineyard as well.
Well, in 2018, I was looking for to pick up a vineyard to do white wine, more specifically a skin contact white wine, you know, orange wine. And I guess I was calling around and like, I'm like, you know, I think the most interesting thing I could do out here could be like Riesling. Nothing else really, you know, I was like looking, you know, grabbing for straws. I didn't really know what was really around and what was available I kind of want Pinot Gris and I didn't want Chardonnay. I was like, you know, Riesling's probably the most interesting thing I could probably find out here. And I got connected with these guys at a vineyard off of Steel and 3 Mile in the Dalles. Harold Hecky is the owner of the vineyard, an old timer that, you know, he's in his 90s now, still like sturdy, like dude, like he's a guy that like, I think he worked for the like urban development in the Dalles back in like 50s and 60s. He was the guy that put up like, you know, power lines in the cherry orchards out there. He was like that guy. But Hillside was planted in 1983 with Lonnie Wright of the Pines, 1852. It's a really interesting vineyard. I mean, it's a magical place. I love that vineyard. I love being in it, and spending a lot of time in it. And I do spend a lot of time in it, so that's good. But it was planted in 1983. It's on its own roots, but we can talk about that specifically later. But as far as what attracted me to it, I remember just walking the block with the foreman, Alejandro Rojas, and who lives on the property and does all the kind of management for the vineyard. And I remember just like looking at this vineyard and where it is, and it just felt like, well, the Dalles is very different. I should just back up a little bit. The Dalles is very different than Hood River as far as what the soils are, what the climate's like. You go from 30 to 40 inches of rain in Hood River to 15 inches in the Dalles in 20 miles if you're lucky. So it's windy, it's dry, the soils are really poor, lussy, kind of like sandy loams. They almost just pulverize in your hand. They're not really deep, heavy clays or anything like that. It's on a hillside, so it's a full south hit, south by southwest. So it gets hot, and any normal person probably looks at that and they're like, well, Riesling doesn't make any sense there. But I was like, this is perfect, because I feel like all those things that I just mentioned, poor soils, poor, nutrient, there's like no organic matter, windy, hot, dry. It has everything that you want in skin contact white wine, And so I knew from day one it was going to be that. I mean, it was pruned that way. It was managed that way from the first moment I stepped in the vineyard. So, and that's how I still manage it. I'm not trying to make Mosel Riesling. I'm not trying to make Alsatian Riesling because I could never do it anyway if I tried. So why not make something that I feel like expresses and reverberates the site more than a wine that I can make in a more classic fashion. So
you talked about the kind of the own rooted still for almost 40-year-old vines.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty uncommon, I would imagine, but more so in the Dalles?
You see more own rooted in like the warmer climates east of the Cascades. Like Walla Walla has a lot of own rooted stuff, and in the Dalles also, I mean, they're really sandy soils. The theory's always been that phylloxera can't really get to them, and not that the phylloxera can't, because now they're starting to see phylloxera, coming in sandier soils, and that's a whole different can of worms. But the bigger problem in the Dalles and climates like that, they're more continental than we are in the valley here. So they're really hot, short, intense seasons. The winters are colder. They get a lot of snow, but they're just short, intense seasons, like I said. And with the propensity for frost, can often come trunk disease like crown gall, and really the only way to, outside of replanting to get rid of crown gall would be to cut everything down to stumps and train suckers up. And that, because if you're on rootstock and you get crown gall, you got to just rip it out. It's kind of a death sentence, if it's advanced enough. I mean, you can learn to live with it in some cases, which I'm learning to live with a lot of trunk disease at my one vineyard right now. But ultimately, that's more of the fear than anything. And often you see like two trunks being trained up. You can cut one down if you need to, and then train another sucker where you still have fruit. So it's on a double line. It's on essentially a Geneva double curtain or a lyre system. So it's almost like a little short pergola in a way. And it's a pain in the ass to work. The vineyard does live up to its name, Hillside, for sure. Yeah.
I'm curious with this kind of relationships. Oftentimes, when you're buying grapes from someone else, you don't have the ability to be in the vineyard as much as it sounds like you are. So, talk about that kind of arrangement for you to kind of do your own vineyard.
They just tolerate me. I don't know why. I pay my bills, I guess that helps, and they like spray special things for me. And it's like, who is this guy? Like, it's the gall. And some city slicking sommelier coming in and telling me not to spray glyphosate. That's exactly what they sound like. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I asked. Asking's free. That's I think, long story short. And while I'm intending to grow, my intentions at this point are to be very active in any vineyard that I ever source fruit from. I don't have to do everything. It's impossible for me to do everything at this point, and foolish. When you have at one vineyard at the Hood River Vineyard, I pretty much do everything except for the sprays by myself. Whereas in the Dalles Vineyard, I have a crew that comes out and helps, but I'll be pruning with them, or I'll be in the vineyard, with them at the same time, and I kind of give them a little example of how I'd like things to be done, and then they just kind of do it, So I'm integrated in that way, but I'm an active participant. Like I said, to call me a farmer would be generous, but at least at this point, that's obviously the goal down the road, but not for a while probably.
So you talked a little bit earlier about your sort of winemaking style. I'm sort of curious if you could define your winemaking philosophy. How would you say you are? How would you describe yourself as a winemaker?
I don't know. I think ultimately I want to make wines that you can't ignore. I don't want to make boring wines. I don't want to make wines that are like, oh yeah, that's fine. That's like the worst reaction. I want to, as far as philosophy and all that, I mean, I used to do spontaneous yeast ferments. No filtration. I haven't filtered a wine yet. Not that I'm like against it per se. Sulfur is really the only additive at any point to the wines, and that's just kind of the style that I like to make, and that's that's not the only way. It's not the right way. It's just the way that I feel like my wines. That's how I've kind of come up in the wine world, in the buying world. So I feel like I've been very much inspired by that world, and it's also, I feel like, the easiest way to do it. I'm pretty lazy. I'm more in the vineyards anyway. I don't have time to be in here. I hate being in the cellar. It's so boring. I'm not going to be a cellar rat for somebody. It's like a nightmare.
Wines that can't be ignored, or has that been your general response as you've taken these to market? Have you gotten fairly strong opinions about them?
I mean, I don't make enough wine at this point for me to be too cocky about it. Be like, oh yeah, well my wines are sold out. Yeah, it's because you didn't make enough wine, idiot. That's why. But I mean, I feel like they are unique. The labels are unique. At the end of the day, I think being a wine buyer and being a somm helps me sell the wines too, because I can talk about the wines, especially my wines, in a really intimate way that I think people can connect to. That's really it. I don't really know, honestly. I mean, they seem to be doing all right, and I feel like people like them, and yeah, I don't know. People keep asking me to do these interviews. I don't understand it.
Do you run into have you run into any kind of issue? You're not making traditional, you're not making Pinot, you're not making Chardonnay.
Yeah.
People respond to Dolcetto?
So far, yeah. I mean, I also do Riesling, obviously, and then I picked up Zinfandel in 2019. I'm always going to be focused in the gorge. I'm not going to make wine in the Willamette Valley or source from valley sources. Not that there's anything wrong with the valley. It's like I have nothing to contribute to the narrative of the valley, and I feel like the gorge is, has a lot of potential. Not only like with like the terroir, but what you can grow on the terroir. I think there's a lot of experimentation with cultivars that you can't necessarily get ripe in the valley, that I'm drawn to. Specifically. You
talked about you've sort of added one variety each year so far. Tell me about, as you look ahead to the future for yourself and your brand, what are you hoping for? What are your goals as you look ahead? My
next goal would be to get another white vineyard and make a non-skin contact wine out of it, just make a traditional white wine. I haven't found it at this point. I mean, I'm trying to get some cuttings to do some grafting this year from a vineyard in Hood River or in the Mosher, but that hasn't happened yet, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But that's the goal, is to, if not that, then maybe plant some white varieties at the Hillside Vineyard in the Dalles. They seem to be open to it, so that's kind of next for me. Keep everything centralized. But I'm always looking for something interesting. I just haven't necessarily, this year, 2020, I'm not expanding beyond what I've made in 2019. And then the hope is I can find something for 2021 that'll be online. So yeah, first year was Dolcetto, second year is Riesling, third year Zin, and then next is white, just a white wine. Just want to make a white wine.
Do you have an ultimate goal in mind? Own vineyard, own winery, certain size? Is there kind of an end destination?
You start fantasizing about silly stuff like that, and it's like, yeah, I want all of it. I mean, yeah, why not? I think vineyard probably would be it would be the ultimate goal. I would probably invest in that first. And even if I didn't have, a structure on the property or had a place to make wine, I can piece together that over the next probably 5 years, while I get maybe sticks in the ground. But finding a property and doing all of that is still a few years away from me. But I think that's probably where I'll start. Yeah, I'd love to have my own winery or shared space with somebody that was kind of like-minded and have a tasting room. I've always kind of fantasized about doing have a bar at the winery as your retail space or your place where you can come and buy your wines in restaurant prices, but also have a dive bar vibe to it, and have chili dogs and pork tenderloin sandwiches, and you can get PBR and a pull of Buffalo Trace, but you could also get Coulis de Sirent from Nicolas Joly, or old Conterno or whatever. But that's just me really just fantasizing about it and wishing that could happen. But I don't know if I'll ever get there, but maybe.
That seems like that would be a hit.
I have a follow-up for that one. So this vineyard that you would look for first, where would you want it?
I feel if somebody dropped $250,000 in my pocket today, I would go looking for the area around Hillside, which is south of the Dalles, that 3 Mile Road area. There's a big vineyard going up there right now that is beautiful. I think there's going to be 60 acres under vine that Joe Cushman's planting for some people. I forget their names, so whatever. I met them. I'm bad with names. It's a big deal. Anyway, that whole area is just magic. I feel you just feel like you're in Tuscany out there, or high desert New Mexico or something like that. And if I were to plant, if I had the access and I had the money and I had the opportunity to do it, that's where I'd look first. Because it's undiscovered. There's no protocols. There's not this is what we do here, so you can do a lot of experimentation. And I think the climate, especially if you get and the soils are interesting, I think if you get the right aspects, you can make really special wines out there. So for me, but I think the Dalles area is an underrated part of the gorge. It's not really technically gorge, it's Columbia Valley, because it's on the edge of the Columbia Gorge AVA, but it's the gorge, whatever. But I feel that area, along with the number of different terroirs in the gorge, need their own AVAs. I feel Mosher Hills, I feel Hood River, I feel Underwood, and I feel the Dalles all deserve their own sub-appellations. And I feel for me, the wines that I want to, the grapes I want to plant and make wine from, I feel that area could be really compelling to do it in.
I was just going to ask you about that. Grapes you're interested in working with beyond what you already have. Is there a certain grape out there you're super excited to do something with?
Not everything. Yes, there's a million of them, but not all of them are available. And, that's part of the problem. I feel in in that Dalles area, I think varieties like Mediterranean varieties will do really well. From reds, I think like Aglianico. I feel like I can see myself planting Aglianico at some point in a warmer site. I feel like Mourvedre could do well. I feel like for whites, I think Fiano, maybe Ferment from Hungary could be interesting. And that site at Hillside specifically, I feel like it's tricky because I feel like you need something that will that's gonna it's not gonna be too hot for it, you know. I mean, you don't necessarily, I mean, there's Chardonnay in that vineyard, and I think it does okay, but it wouldn't be the first thing I'd plant necessarily there. And not to criticize them for planting Chardonnay, but I feel like things like Fiano or like Acertico or things of that nature could be interesting in that climate as well. But yeah, we all have a wish list of things that you can't get, and you know, I think probably at the top of that list would be Nerello Mascalese from Sicily. That would be, I think, if I could have my druthers and get that planted at some time in my life, that would be that is a big goal, actually. You know, it'll eventually be available, and I think that area will be perfect for it.
It's like your legacy grape.
Well, I don't think about stuff like that too much, but.
So you moved up to Portland in 2007. I'm curious what your sort of initial impressions were of the Oregon wine industry at that point.
I feel like it was still, I wouldn't say finding its identity. I think things have changed quite a bit in Oregon wine in the last 10, 12 years. I think people are more experimental now. I think there's, you know, I think people are drinking wines out of the region more now than I think there was maybe, I don't want to say isolated then, because that's not true. That's a little misleading, but I feel like it was just, you know, it wasn't as exciting as it is now. You know, I feel like now there's a lot of vibrancy and a lot of energy in all different kinds of Oregon wine, not only the Valley, but Valley specifically. There's a lot of cool things happening down here, and a lot of great younger producers coming up. But you still, you know, have the old guys still doing great stuff also. So I feel like it's just a good time to be a wine drinker if you like Oregon wine, because there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy, and you know, there's a lot going on here for sure. And like, not to say that it wasn't then, but I think everything that was going on then was building to kind of where we are now, and I feel like we can even go further as far as experimenting with different cultivars, whether it's in the Willamette Valley or in the Gorge or wherever. So I think that's the next 10 years will be even maybe more exciting than what we've seen prior to now. You know.
What do you think the industry will look like then in 10 years? What will have changed at that point?
We're growing more Syrah in the Willamette Valley, probably, sadly. But I think you're going to see more warm climate varieties. I mean, it's already happening, obviously. You know, you look at a warmer appellation like Yamhill Carlton, you're like, man, you maybe need to start grafting your Pinot over to something else. You know, especially some of those West hits get really cooked. There could be an opportunity though to find something that's really unique and that does really well in those spots. Not singling out Yamhill Carlton or anything like that, but I feel like, you know, there's going to be more varieties planted that are going to be suited, sadly, to global warming, and I feel like the Gorge is going to be the same way, and that's where it's tricky. When you're planning stuff now, you're like, you gotta think, you know, what's it gonna be like? Is the world gonna be 2 degrees hotter? You know, or what's our typical harvest gonna be? You know, I feel like we haven't had 2019, you know, aside, which is, we had rain. You know, it was crazy. It wasn't like a hot summer, but I feel like the last 10 years, it was like the opposite of what it used to be like. You know, where in the 80s or the 90s, like every 10th vintage or so was a hot vintage, whereas conversely now it's 1 in 10 vintages is going to be a cold vintage or a classic vintage, whatever you want to call it. So I feel like the biggest change will probably have to do with what's being planted in new vineyards and what the trends are in the world of wine is going to contribute that, but it's also going to be people looking at their vines and be like, wow, this variety maybe doesn't work here anymore. And I think there's going to be some sad realities of that. But also opportunities. But, you know, that global warming is, you know, is really going to be affecting the wine world in I think in a pretty negative way ultimately in the next 50 years, unless we get our act together. But it's another podcast or another interview, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty big topic to dive down there.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there, in addition to that, if there's anything else on the horizon that concerns you for the industry as a whole. Are there other things that you're seeing that worry you as you look ahead for the wine industry future here?
I feel like, I mean, the elephant in the room for me are chemicals like glyphosate. I feel like they should just ban it from live. I think they should just get out of there. And maybe they're in the process of it. I don't know if they are. I feel like getting some of the, you know, I'm not super hardcore about like people using some of the powdery mildew sprays, but I feel like things like Roundup are being proven that they're really bad for people, and then you shouldn't spray them, and they're really bad for vines, and they're really bad for soils, and etc. I feel like things like that would be nice if, you know, they were eradicated. It's probably not going to happen. There's too much money involved and too much interest for people like, you know, for Roundup to get banned in viticulture. I just wish people would stop using things like that. You know, it's hard to stop because Roundup is easy. It works. You do it once, and I understand why people do it. But I think when you look at the other side of the balance of the scale, it's not, for me, it's not worth it. It's not worth poisoning your employees and maybe even people that drink the wine. I mean, they're finding that there are glyphosate levels in wine that in vineyards that, you know, I've seen that in California, but I'm not quoting a peer-reviewed paper or anything like that. But, you know, at any rate, I feel like that's the boogeyman that we should just get rid of once and for all. And that's kind of the arrangement I have with all my vineyards is like no pre-emergence, no glyphosate. That's like step one, you know. So I've got a little band of like, you know, organically managed vines in a sea of what would ultimately be live. They're not live certified, but they would essentially be live. But that's, for me, is spraying more reasonably, more ecologically. I think that not only will help with soils and doing maybe natural adjustments to soils for nitrogen, for example, you know, using composts and, you know, different, you know, organic, you know, means for nitrogen as opposed to putting in like ammonium in the soils and stuff like that. And I feel like that's another part of it. Building soils, regenerative viticulture, farming, whatever you want to talk about, I feel like is the future. And I feel like if you're not getting on that train now, you're going to be left behind, and you're ultimately, I feel like, going to be left behind from a consumer standpoint as well. I think people, especially younger people, it means a lot more. People give a shit about it, you know, and they should. And I feel like people that are going to ignore that or just have this, you know, oh well, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. This is the way we've always done it. You don't know anything, you know, and just doing things the conventional way. I think they're going to become dinosaurs. I think they'll go away. And I feel like the trend is to be more of a steward of the environment now more than ever. And I think it's just going to increase. At least it should. And I feel like Oregon's always been at the forefront of that. And I feel like you know, there's more biodynamic wineries here than any other AVA in the country. And there's a reason that, you know, there's a groundswell of that because it's been going on a long time. Oregon's been always at the forefront for, you know, natural viticulture or holistic viticulture, whatever you want to call it. And I feel like I don't know, maybe becoming more mainstream now, and it's easier to do now than it was 20 years ago. Especially if we're getting hotter vintages now. It's certainly a lot easier to spray when it's hot all the time. It's like, would you prefer mildew or would you prefer sunburn? It's like, that's the age-old question. But ultimately, I feel like people are getting better at doing it, you know, and there's more people that I think consumer-wise are going to demand it and are demanding it already. Like buyers like myself or other buyers, it's like, it's kind of a prereq at this point. You know, it's like, you don't be a jerk to the environment. That's it. You know, you don't have to be like all the way hardcore BD with like gnomes in your vineyard or anything like that. But, you know, I feel like pumping the brakes on some of the herbicides and you know, building soil and using cover crops, and I think it's all part of, you know, soil health and doing the right thing for the environment, but also I think the wines as well. That's just my theory, like low to no-till farming and all those things.
So if someone were to come to you and say they wanted to be in the Oregon wine industry, what would your words of wisdom to them be?
I don't know. It depends on how much money they have. You know, if they're like some rugrat like me, I would be like, well, I think there's a great tradition in wine, in the world of wine, not just Oregon, but anywhere, of, you know, mentorship and apprenticeships, and learning from people that have more experience than you do, and listening, and not, you know, thinking you know everything so soon. I think getting your ass kicked at harvest a couple times helps. You know, I would probably recommend doing a harvest somewhere, honestly, first, and see if you got the bug or not. It's either you will or you won't, I think, after that first harvest. And, you know, for me, it's, yeah, you know, keep learning. You know, whether that's go to school or not, I don't think there's necessarily you have to do one or the other. But, you know, ask a lot of questions and, you know, take notes and continue to learn as you mature. You're never going to know everything. You know, you can experiment. Experimentation for me is the only thing that's consistent year to year in how I farm or how I make the wines. So I feel like I would pass that on as well. And that's what makes it more interesting anyway. You know, give a shit, be enthused, be passionate about something, you know.
Okay, so all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked? Anything
I don't think so. I think you covered all the bases.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time today, sharing your stories and your thoughts with us, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Awesome.